All right. We now have Doug Wheatley. Go ahead, Doug. All righty. I would like now to introduce the singer-songwriter Megan Woodruff, a graduate of Capital University's Conservatory of Music. Megan will now sing the national anthem. So would everybody please rise?
Yeah. Reach that arm.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Okay. Right arm.
Okay, y'all may be seated. I want to welcome everyone, all the visitors, and especially the honored guests. This has been a couple years in the making, and we are especially pleased that we have this beautiful day and this beautiful location for this ceremony today. So thank you all so very much for coming. What I wanted to do is to give you a little bit of history as to how this all came about. Several years ago, a gentleman contacted the Historical Society and he said, I have a proposition for you. He said, I have a memorial tombstone that it's historical, and we replaced it with a modern tombstone, and we did not want to destroy the old one, so we wondered if maybe the historical village would like to have this tombstone. It was in reference to a soldier who had passed away during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The soldier's name was Weston Harrington, and Rusty Wilson, the gentleman who proposed this, was one of his descendants. So Randy Smith, one of our members, thought it was a great idea, and he approached the board of directors. They approved putting it here in the village. We went to the city of Hilliard, and the city of Hilliard approved it, and so we were getting ready to have it moved here, and then all of a sudden the COVID virus hit. So this is really a tribute to Randy Smith for having the foresight to accept this and led to what we're doing here today. So anyway, we finally had the monument installed, and Randy wanted to have a dedication ceremony, but he started to fall ill and was not able to follow up on his idea about this. And finally then this last year, when we were planning this year's activities, we brought it up again. So I happened to be talking to a friend of mine from Kentucky. Some of you would know him. His name was Tom Gard, and he said that one of my classmates also said that they had a member of their family who died in the Battle of Little Bighorn. And I said, wow. And he says, do you know Peggy O'Harra? And I said, everybody knows Peggy O'Harra, right? But anyway, I said, I sure do. And anyway, he said, you ought to give her a call. So I called Peggy, who's now Peggy Murdoch, and I talked to her, and she was so excited, and she was telling me about her family member, and that's where it really started the ball rolling. As we further went into research of these two families, it was very interesting. We found out that both of the soldiers were from Alton, Ohio. Alton is just about 6-7 miles south of Hilliard, down on Broad Street, and they had both entered the service within 4 days of each other. So we were pretty sure that they knew each other before they did that. Anyway, they actually entered the service after the Reconstruction Act from following the Civil War, and their original plans were to help in the Reconstruction of the South, and those plans kind of got changed when Custer then went out west to help the surveyors, protect the surveyors, and to help the pioneers. So anyway, as an unfortunate thing happened, we had the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and these soldiers both were killed. Now, what's interesting about them is that Miles O'Harra was the very first soldier in the battle who was killed, the very first. And then Weston Harrington was the only soldier whose body was not desecrated by the Indians afterward. And the reason for that was that about several months prior to the battle, Tom Custer had captured Lakota Chief Rain in the Face, and they were going to execute him. Well, Weston Harrington didn't think that was a good idea. He didn't want to have an Indian uprising. They weren't into that. And so they planned for the chief to escape. And he did. And Custer never knew how the Indian got loose. But anyway, after the battle, the Indians were coming back, and they were scalping, whatever. But they saw who this soldier was, and they realized that he had helped the Indians at one time. And so they threw a blanket over his body to indicate that his body was not to be harmed or desecrated in any way, that he had some connection, positive connection with the Indian. So that is kind of the story behind this. And then, as we did some further research, we found that both the Harrington and the O'Harra family had members, descendants after that, who went through the Hilliard School. And so I wrote an article for the Hilliard this week about the Battle of Little Bighorn and its Hilliard connection. And Weston Harrington's niece, Emma Harrington, was in Hilliard's very first graduating class. There was only 2 in that class, but she was in the very first graduating class. The O'Harra family moved to Hilliard from the Alton area eventually, and Bill O'Harra, who happens to be Peggy's father, was a principal in the school district, and then Peggy and her brother Michael went through the Hilliard school system. Now, interesting, Emma Harrington was the one who gave the commencement address for her class graduation back in 1888, and Peggy O'Harra gave the commencement address for her class in 1960. So there's a lot of parallels between these two families, and it's interesting when you get into the history, the facts that came about with these two families. So that is why this all came about, and this was a great deal of thanks to Randy Smith, who had the foresight, and so I wanted to make this dedication ceremony a tribute to Randy Smith, and he was a longtime member of the society, and he was a visionary whose many ideas helped the society grow and develop into this wonderful historic park. So Randy sadly has recently passed away and will be greatly missed. And Randy, may you rest in peace. So Barb, could you come up here? I have something for you. This is the tribute we wrote for Bob about Randy, and we are so grateful for his service to the Historical Society and to the community. So thank you so much. We will now have a member of the O'Harra family come up and speak, and then our main speaker will follow that. So Peggy, you could come forward, please.
Good morning. Beautiful morning. Today I'm here to represent the family members and the friends of Miles O'Harra. First of all, I'm here to express our gratitude to the Hilliard Historical Society and the Hilliard Department of Parks and Recreation, who does a lot of work, and they've done a lot of work for this event today. Over the years, the story of Miles O'Harra and Weston Harrington have been shared and retold in countless books. There's been a PBS TV documentary on Miles O'Harra, and thousands of ranger talks for folks who visit the Little Bighorn Battlefield and Museum in Montana. If you visit there, and I hope you do, the one thing you will see is a bust, a sculpture of Miles O'Harra, a facial reconstruction done of him and the story of his death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So these two young soldiers left Alton, Ohio, gave their service and their ultimate sacrifice to our country in the Army's 7th Cavalry Division in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We are so grateful as family and friends that now there is a way to establish honor to them in our local community, and we're very grateful to all of you. I want to especially thank Tim Woodruff and the volunteers and the members of the Hilliard Historical Society. They work to preserve this history of the Hilliard community in this amazing museum and historical village. Now, Tim's a true communicator, I think you can tell, who's especially good at establishing connections of people to places, people and places him know that my great-great-uncle, our great-great-uncle, many of you here, fought and died on the same day at the Battle of Little Bighorn with Western Harrington. And I also told him about our family connection of moving from Prairie Township, living in New Rome, coming to the Hilliard Public Schools. My father taught biology here in the high school and then became a principal. So then our conversations led, how might the two of these young soldiers have been connected to each other? We kept saying, they must have known each other. You know, were their families connected? And what were these families and soldiers, how were they connected to these communities? Now, fortunately for me, I grew up in a family that communicated. They communicated the history of how they got here, what they did, and the adventures that they shared along the way. Over the years in the O'Harra family, there were lots of horse stories, war stories, lots of politics, and often the mention, though, of the US Army Cavalry Soldiers of Miles O'Harra. So I thank my brother and sister who were keepers of a treasure trove of family history through postcards, letters, and I thank the Operation Flag Memorial Ceremony that took place in Alton, Ohio in 2003 that commemorated Civil War veterans from Alton, Ohio. So we filled in a lot of missing information over this last year and a half. The search begins with the information about the national road that came out of Franklinton, and we call it Route 40 or Broad Street today. As that road expanded to come westward, the settlers and the pioneers wanted to leave for the prairie lands, the great agricultural lands that were along this road. New Rome, Alton, Darby Creek, Norwich Prairie, and Brown Township. Settlers from both the O'Harra and the Harrington families were among those who left Franklinton. And they farmed the land, they established new businesses, and they served as justices of peace and postmasters. Peter Harrington, Weston's father, was a shoemaker in Alton, Ohio. Joseph O'Harra, Miles' grandfather, was the first postmaster of Darby Creek Village in Brown Township. So land from the northern part of Prairie Township and Norwich contributed to lay out Brown Township. Schools, churches developed, and I found it interesting that Brown Township provided education to the children of the freed slaves who were settled there. In the morning, the children of Brown Township went to the school, the one-room schoolhouse. If they left at noon, probably to work in the fields, right? As those schools were opened in the afternoon, then they allowed for the children of the freed slaves to come in to have school in the Brown Township Hilton area. So when students completed their grammar school education in Norwich Prairie and Brown Township, they had to come to Hilliard to go to high school. And that continued until 1958. In fact, our sister-in-law, Sonny Frogger, was in the last class that came from New Rome to graduate in Hilliard. The other connections, of course, were after the Civil War ended, there was an enrollment act of 1966 because the infantry and the cavalry had been decimated after the Civil War. So there were recruitment centers set up. Miles and Weston enlisted in the Army in 1872. Miles was 21 years of age, Weston was 17 years of age when they enlisted within 4 days of each other. Then they both traveled their companies to South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi to enforce and provide protection for that Reconstruction effort in the South after the slaves were freed in the Civil War. As the Indian attacks grew more frequent and the numbers in the encampment along the Little Bighorn increased, Custer gathered all 10 of his companies of the 7th Cavalry at Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakotas. And in those two companies, Company L and Company M, Weston and Miles were both training for battle for the Little Bighorn River. They were sent to fight, and on June 25th, 1876, both were killed. Miles O'Harra had received his promotion from corporal to sergeant only days before the battle. And at that time, it was said that he was the first man of Company M who was killed there at the skirmish line of the Reno Valley site. Both were distinguished in death, as you heard, but by very different circumstances. Today, this memorial honors their service and the sacrifice of two young 7th Cavalry soldiers here in their home community. And on behalf of the O'Harra family, I would like to thank you all for coming today. Thank you.
Now, the main speaker for today then is Mr. Eric Wittenberg. He is a program coordinator for many of his association's events. He is an award-winning Civil War historian, author, lecturer, tour guide, and battlefield preservationist. He is a practicing attorney in downtown Columbus, and he serves as both moderator and facilitator at many of their conferences. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Eric Wittenberg.
Thank you, Tim. It's an honor and a privilege to have been asked to do this. I coincidentally was doing some research. I saw the article that Tim had written about Weston Harrington's monument being placed here, and it got my interest. And I ended up digging into it, as I often do. And in the process of doing so, I actually found the missing link between the village of Alton and how Weston Harrington and Miles O'Harra ended up joining the 7th Cavalry, because there was a third soldier from Alton who also fought at the Little Bighorn and who survived. So we'll get to that. In 1819, Prairie Township was set off and organized on the west side of Franklin County. It exists in large part because of the national road. It included a considerable part of what is today known as Brown Township. In 1836, after completion of the national road, Thomas Graham laid out the community of Alton, which was the largest village in Prairie Township. Other founders included Francis Downing, Israel P. Brown, William Stairwell, George Ritchie, Russell N. Grinnell, John G. Neff, Reuben Galladay, here's a familiar name, Thomas O'Harra, David Howard, Thomas J. Gorman, John Gantz, Samuel Kell, Andrew W. Shearer, and Smith Postal. Thomas Graham, who was so important to the development of this little community, was its first postmaster, died in 1840. Alton straddled the national road. It had its own post office, and the township's first tavern and inn called the Alton House. Just north of the village was an area known as Alton Station, which was a stop on the Little Miami Railroad. After 1843, many churches were built in the area, including an 1883 brick Methodist Episcopal church that was likely served by circuit riding preachers. By 1840, the population of Prairie Township was reported at 606. In 1850, it was 1,043. In 1853, the township constituted 7 school districts and contained an aggregate of 411 youths between the age of 5 and 21 years. In 1857, the aggregate total of such youth had risen to 451. By 1860, Prairie Township had a population of 1,369, and in 1870, the census reported 1,364. The village of Alton probably numbered somewhere between 150 200 residents during this period. So before we get to that, the story of Miles and Weston and even that of Thomas Graham, we need to briefly talk just a little bit about the outbreak of the Civil War. The state of Ohio had established a large recruiting, training, and supply depot a few miles to the east of Alton along the national road that became known as Camp Chase, named for former Ohio Governor Solomon P. Chase, which later housed a large Confederate prisoner of war camp. Numerous volunteer regiments mustered and trained there before shipping out, including the 40th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. 40th Ohio was organized at Camp Chase between September and November 1861. The regiment was first assigned to the Army of the Ohio and later to the Army of the Cumberland. The 40th Ohio was a hard-fighting regiment assigned to the Army of the Cumberland's 4th Corps, fighting in all the Army of the Cumberland's campaigns from the Tullahoma campaign in June and July of 1863, the battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga, all of the engagements of the 1864 Atlantic campaign, and the horrific Battle of Franklin on November 30, 1864. The regiment's term of service ended on December 10, 1864. You'll see why it's an important thing here in a moment. Thomas Eaton Graham, a nephew of the founder of Alton, Thomas Graham, was born there on November 20, 1831. He stood 5 feet 6 3/4 inches tall, had gray eyes, light hair, and a fair complexion. He clearly enjoyed being a soldier because he spent a significant part of his adult life in military service. He enlisted in the U.S. Army at the age of 17 in 1848. He served for 5 years helping in the construction of Fort Laramie in Wyoming. In 1854, after receiving his discharge from the Army, he married Susan Postal. You remember the name Smith Postal that I mentioned earlier. A member of one of the other founding members of our families of Alton, and had a long and fruitful marriage. They had 7 children. So he was residing in Alton when the recruitment of the 40th Ohio began in the fall of 1861. He enlisted, and because of his prior experience, was immediately appointed one of the sergeants. He remained at Camp Chase when the regiment went into the field and for active duty on December 17, 1861, and was discharged from the Army that day by civil authority. We wonder why, and it says his consolidated service records give a hint. They say, taken by the sheriff of Franklin County, Ohio, December 16 on writ of habeas corpus, but we don't know the reasons why. Graham returned home, lived here briefly, moved to Illinois, and enlisted in the 7th Cavalry, so this is his 3rd term of service, on November 4, 1872. He served in Company G of the 7th and fought with Major Marcus Reno's battalion in the Battle of Little Bighorn, and unlike Weston Harrington and Miles O'Harra, he survived. After his term of service, the Army 7th Cavalry finally ended. Graham returned to Columbus in 1877. He worked first as an iron finisher, a drill presser, and something called a stationary engineer, which is somebody who fixes equipment. He also briefly owned and operated a cigar store in the Short North area of Columbus. For part of his post-war career, he worked for the Columbus Buggy Company, which became the largest lightweight buggy manufacturer in the world. In 1891, he was awarded a Civil War veteran's disability pension arising out of his brief service with the 40th Ohio. These pension records indicate that he was nearly blind, had severe digestive problems, was very nervous and debilitated, that he also suffered from cardiac problems. He died at his home on Sunday, February 14, 1907, and was buried in the Dayton National Cemetery, although there is a small cenotaph for him in the Graham family plot in Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus. As the only one of the 3 Alton soldiers who survived the battle, he's an interesting story, and it's a story that had never been told. He had a great impact on the lives and deaths of Weston Harrington and Miles O'Harra. Peter Harrington, also a native of Alton, enlisted in Company C of the 40th Ohio at Camp Chase, serving alongside his fellow Altonian, Sergeant Thomas Graham. He was 39 years old when he enlisted in 1861, wounded in combat at the Battle of Chickamauga on September 19, 1863, but returned to duty. He was discharged upon the expiration of his term of service on October 8, 1864, and returned to Alton, where he worked as a laborer building barns. He served as the postmaster of Alton from 1866 to 1876 and had two sons, Weston, born on February 9, 1855, and Orville, born on December 3, 1865. So, Thomas Graham and Peter Harrington served in the same company of the same regiment. So there's no question they knew each other. There's just no question about it. And consequently, I don't think there's any question that Thomas Graham knew Weston Harrington, as we'll see. At age 17, after working as a laborer and lying about his age, Weston Harrington enlisted in the 7th Cavalry for a term of 5 years on November 4, 1872. He stood 5 feet, 8 inches tall, had brown hair, brown eyes, and a fair complexion. He reported for duty in Yorkville, South Carolina on December 9, 1872. He was assigned to Company L of the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant James Calhoun, the brother-in-law of the regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Custer. A skilled carpenter, he also served as a teamster, responsible for driving one of the company's supply wagons. He was also trained to fight, just as any other trooper was. He served honorably with the regiment in the field and suffered a gunshot wound and a fractured right elbow in June 1873, spending a good 6 months at the post hospital at the 7th Cavalry's base of operations, Fort Abraham Lincoln, near Bismarck in the Dakota Territory. Upon being released from the hospital, he rejoined his company, participating in various campaigns in the 7th Cavalry until the beginning of the Great Sioux War in 1876. When Custer split the 7th Cavalry into 3 battalions for the assault on Great Indian Village on the morning of June 25, 1876, Harrington's Company L went with Custer's battalion 5 companies and deployed on a knoll that is now known as Calhoun Hill. Custer's battalion appears to have advanced all the way to the Little Bighorn River before pulling back to a prominent ridgeline, today known as Last Stand Hill, if you've ever visited the battlefield. Moving to counter the threat posed by Custer's advance, throngs of warriors attacked Companies C, I, and L, which halted on a knoll along the ridgeline between Last Stand Hill and the position held by the Reno Benteen Battalion. Along with routed survivors of Company C, Calhoun's troopers at the southern end of the ridge appear to have put up stiff resistance before being overwhelmed. Captain Miles W. Keogh's company perished on the east side of Battle Ridge, just north of Calhoun Hill. The survivors of these attacks, apparently including Weston Harrington, rushed toward the hill at the northwest end of the long ridge where Custer's battalion was. Sergeant John Rafter of Company C stated that Harrington's body was found and that the body had not been mutilated, and the Sioux had thrown a blanket over his remains. Rafter said that Harrington was known among the Sioux before he was enlisted, and it was thought that some of them recognized him and protected his body in that way. Paints Brown, a Sioux warrior, left an account regarding a soldier who was probably Harrington. We found a soldier sitting against the dead body of his horse. He was still alive, but had been shot through his abdomen. He could speak a little Sioux, and he said, "My friends, I'm in a bad way. I wish you would take me to a tent." We got off our horses and crowded around, and one of us spoke up. "Why, he is my friend." "Yes," he replied, "I was at Standing Rock in Fort Lincoln." We got on our horses again, and 2 of us reached down and took him under the armpits and tried to lead him away, but he said, "Oh, I can't walk, my legs hurt." Then he dropped down and died. Colonel Alfred B. Welch of the North Dakota National Guard, who did not fight in the Little Bighorn, spent much of his life attempting to document the role of his adopted father, Chief John Grass of the Yanktonai Sioux Nation, in the battle. Welch was fluent in the Sioux dialect, so he was a valuable resource in documenting Indian recollections of the battle. In an interview, he recounted, after the battle, 2 Dakota, meaning Sioux, came across a soldier who was badly wounded. They thought they might get him away from the place alive, so they took him up between them on their horses. After they had gone some distance, one said, "He is going to die," and the other said, "Well, let's kill him then." So one of them held his head up and the other hit him with the butt of his gun and killed him there. Another theory was that the Sioux were aware that in 1874 at Fort Abraham Lincoln, Harrington was among a group of troopers of the 7th Cavalry who facilitated the escape of the famed Lakota war chief, Rain in the Face, who later fought at the Little Bighorn. And recognizing Harrington, the warriors covered his body with a blanket and did not mutilate him. Burial details found Harrington's remains on Last Stand Hill near the bodies of Boston Custer and Audie Reed, the brother and nephew of George and Thomas Custer. He was interred on Last Stand Hill with most of the rest of the men of Custer's battalion. His name is listed on the monument that stands atop the mass grave, along with the names of the other 267 soldiers who died at the Little Bighorn. His body remains there to this day. However, he was not forgotten at home at all. The Harrington family included a reference to the dead hero on his parents' grave marker, as we'll see a little later on. An obelisk was placed in the community cemetery, where his parents are listed on one side and Weston on the other. The marker declared, "Killed in the Custer Massacre, June 25, 1876. As Tim mentioned, that grave stood on his parents' grave, or that obelisk stood on his parents' grave until 2020, when the weathered marker was replaced with a new one, arranged for by Rusty Wilson. The original marker was moved here to Weaver Park. It's just north of Hall. This is what Rusty said to me. He said, "I'm happy it's preserved and being used for history." As you'll see a bit later. Timothy O'Harra, the son of another of the founding families of Alton, also served honorably in the Civil War. The 95th Ohio Volunteer Infantry also mustered in Camp Chase. On August 7, 1862, O'Harra, age 32, spent his entire term of service as a private in Company C. The 95th Ohio joined the Army of the Ohio and Kentucky and fought in the October 1862 Battle of Perryville. When the Army of Ohio was absorbed into the Army of the Tennessee, the 95th Ohio went with it, participating in the Siege of Vicksburg. Assigned to Major General Andrew J. Smith's 16th Corps, the 95th Ohio fought against Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry at Tupelo and Bryce's Crossroads in Mississippi before joining the Army of Cumberland in Nashville in the fall of 1864. Finally, the 95th Ohio participated in the campaign to capture Mobile, Alabama in the spring of 1865. The regiment and Private O'Harra mustered out of the federal service in Alabama in August of 1865. Newly released from his military service, Timothy O'Harra returned home to Alton and his family, which now included 6 children. One of those 6 was his son, Miles F. O'Harra, born in September 1851. Young Miles enlisted in the 7th Cavalry on October 30, 1872, joining Graham as a trooper in the famed Regiment of Horse Soldiers. He stood 5 feet, 8 1/4 inches tall, had light hair, gray eyes, and a ruddy complexion. He joined Company M, serving honorably. He was promoted from corporal to sergeant just days before the 7th Cavalry's expedition, before the Sioux began on June 22, 1876, replacing Sergeant John Dolan, who was discharged at the end of his term of service, leaving a need for a non-division officer. Company M's first sergeant, John Ryan, said of him, "O'Harra was considered a very fine soldier and troop troop," he said. Years later, he lamented, "We missed him very much." O'Harra's Company M was part of Major Marcus Reno's battalion, and he was part of the dismounted skirmish line that led Reno's advance as the outbreak of the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was one of the first troopers to fall in the battle, suffering a mortal wound. He was probably, can't say for sure, but was probably the first to fall. Private Edward Pigford served in O'Harra's Company M. In 1932, he stated, "Sergeant O'Harra, Troop M, was badly hit, and he returned to me with the plea, 'Pigford, don't leave me,' and I helped him to a place of safety." However, Pigford later admitted to another historian that he ignored O'Harra's cries for help and abandoned him to his fate. That historian wrote, "One of the bodies was not found at all. It was that of Sergeant O'Harra of M Company." First Sergeant John Ryan of the company says, apparently dead on the skirmish line when the men left it and went into the timber woods. But when they looked for O'Hara's body on June 27th, it was nowhere to be found. Ryan said, "I understand at the time that there was a man's head found suspended by wires from a tripod in one of the lodges in the Indian camp. There had been a fire under it as the hair was all burned off the head, although I did not see it myself. The report was at the time that it belonged to Sergeant O'Harra of my company. However, Ryan was wrong. This was the head of John Armstrong, identified by another officer, Captain Miles Boyd. The rest of Armstrong's body was found in the valley, and he was also buried in the mass grave on Last Stand Hill." General Nelson Miles visited the battlefield in the spring of 1878 and interviewed several of the Native American warriors who had fought there. They pointed out a place a short distance from the timber where they killed the first soldier, who had, as they said, a large yellow stripe down the side of his trousers, recounted General Miles. This meant that the first man they killed was a sergeant of the 7th Cavalry, consistent with the claim that O'Harra was the first casualty. Army Assistant Sergeant Robert W. Schufelt, traveling with a party of Sioux Scouts commanded by Captain Galbraith Rogers of the 5th Cavalry, claimed that he found O'Hara's skull and jawbone on Reno's skirmish line in 1877 near some rotted trousers which still contained faded double yellow stripes, which would have indicated a fallen trumpeter. He reported that one of the Sioux who claimed to have seen the soldier fall at the outset of the battle told him that an Indian woman mutilated the man's face with a war club after the battle. Schufelt later donated that skull to the United States Army Medical Museum located in Washington, D.C. as a medical specimen. But it wasn't O'Hara's. O'Hara's partial remains were found on Reno Benteen Hill, though they were not identified until 1988. In 1958, an archaeologist digging for the construction of the tour road that passes through the battlefield found the remains of 3 troopers buried there. The remains ultimately identified as O'Hara's consisted of the skull, the left arm, a rib, and a vertebra. Before reburying the remains of the 3 troopers at the National Cemetery in Bighorn, scientists examined them and made casts of the skulls. The scientists made a clay sculpture of the face and then used a television camera to superimpose a known photograph of O'Harra, the one that's in your program today. And it was a perfect match. Despite having little hope of being able to identify the soldier, they were able to positively identify O'Hara's partial remains. However, they exposed another mystery. If O'Harra was mortally wounded on the skirmish line in the opening phases of the battle, how did his remains end up on the bluffs? There's a plausible explanation. He suffered a mortal wound during the valley fight and was transported up the bluffs to Reno Benteen Hill during the retreat of Reno's battalion and later died there. Thus, it seems unlikely that anyone spotted O'Hara's remains in the valley, as claimed, like so many mysteries associated with the Battle of Little Bighorn. We'll probably never know the answer when O'Hara's remains were buried in the National Cemetery. That such a tiny community as Alton, Ohio, provided 3 troopers to the 7th Cavalry in the 1870s is remarkable. Given that Peter Harrington and Thomas Graham served in the same company in the 40th Ohio Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War, and given the size of the community, that connection undoubtedly led to young Weston Harrington's enlistment in the 7th Cavalry. Likewise, Miles O'Harra was a member of another founding family in the community who undoubtedly knew both Graham and Harrington before he also joined the 7th Cavalry. In short, the relationship between these 3 young men was neither accidental nor coincidental, but is rather a story that has never been fully documented previously. Today, the village of Alton is within the boundaries of the Hilliard School District in the Columbus suburbs. Weston Harrington's descendant, Emma Harrington, was a member of the Hilliard High School's initial graduating class, which consisted of 2 students. Miles O'Hara's descendant, William Bill O'Harra, became a principal in the school district and had numerous family members attend or graduate from Hilliard schools. Bill O'Harra is also remembered for building Hilliard's first public swimming pool, and O'Harra family members still reside on O'Harra Road in Alton. Despite the sacrifices of Weston Harrington and Miles O'Harra, their respective families continue to live in or near Alton, and life went
we will have the unveiling of the monuments and the historical plaque. So if you all come over to the Memorial Garden area. And the historical markers. So maybe if you and Mike would like to pull off the covering of the O'Harra monument. We are so thankful that the O'Harra family had agreed to purchase this monument and have it placed here in the Memorial Garden area along with the Harrington family. Now, Mike, could you help me unveil the Harrington? This was the first monument that was moved here in 2020. It says Weston Harrington, born February 9th, 1855, killed in Custer Massacre, June 25th, 1876. The O'Harra monument says Miles F. O'Harra, U.S. Army Sergeant, Company M, 7th Cavalry, September 10th, 1851 to June 25th, 1876. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is the bronze historical marker that we have made up to honor these two soldiers and their service to the country and to the community. And it says, this memorial garden is to honor two soldiers who died with Lieutenant Colonel George Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn. The amazing facts are that both soldiers were from Alton, just south of here, and had descendants who graduated from the Hilliard School. Sergeant Miles O'Harra has the distinction of being the first soldier who was killed in the battle, and Weston Harrington was the only soldier whose body was not desecrated out of respect for his past efforts on behalf of the Indians. So, I am particularly proud and thankful for this service today and for this memorial garden. Okay, now I do want, before we close this program, I do want to have a few thank yous. I particularly want to thank Peggy O'Harra Murdoch for all of her work, the O'Harra Monument, the programs, the refreshments, and the dedication that she put into this effort. Thank you to the Harrington family for their tombstone donation, and I'm so sorry that they couldn't be here to represent their family. Thank you to Eric Wittenberg for being our main speaker and for his generous donation to the society in honor of this dedication ceremony. I wanted to thank my granddaughter Megan Woodruff, who sang the national anthem. Thanks to the Hilliard High School class of '62, they donated the flagpole and the stone honoring that. It was a generous donation from them, and we were much appreciative all over the years of their support for the Historical Society and the Historic Village. Thanks to the Hilliard VFW Post 4931. We want to thank the Hilliard Police Honor Guard, who is about to perform their duty today. Thanks to Warrant Officer Doug Wheatley for sounding attention and the taps. About 10 years ago, this is interesting, Doug also played taps at the Little Bighorn National Park. So this has a special meaning for him and for us here today. Thank you, Doug. Thank you to Kevin Corvo for Hilliard This Week's newspaper articles and for their promotion of this event and for all that they've done for the Historical Society over the years. Thank you, Michael O'Harra, for his participation here in a few minutes. Thanks to the Norwich Township trustees, administration, for the city recreation and park, and for Modlick, who performed the monument and installing the marble is here. This walkway was performed by the Cornwell Lawn and Garden Landscape Service. So we want to thank them. And a special thanks to all members of the Hilliard Historical Society for all the behind-the-scenes work that they did to put this on. All right, now I would like Michael O'Harra to present us with the benediction.
Good morning. My name is Michael O'Harra. I'm with the O'Harra next brand new company. I think I'm talking about the Explorer. Right together. Can you hear me now? Okay. I live in Pompano Beach, Florida, but I was very familiar. Coming home. I would like to offer the closing benediction. If you could please pray. May the Lord God bless us all present here today. Memorialize Miles and Weston, who lived and died to preserve liberty and freedom in our nation. And may the Lord God remember all those who sacrificed and gave this nation's greatness, progress, and riches. And our memories and all of those who served in the armed forces be an honorable one, full of thanksgiving to the Lord, and remember with much love and mercy those who died in the service of our country. May the strength of God sustain us. May the power of God preserve us. May the hands of God protect us. And may the way of God direct us. May the love of God go with us this day and forever. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will look over here to the north as the VFW post performs their salute.
Detail, report arms. Present arms.
concludes our ceremony today for the dedication of the memorial garden with these two families. So I invite you all now to go